Okay, welcome to the week three go to session. So, this is the third out of four sessions that we're holding this month. Thanks everyone for attending. As I just announced to the group, this is for the people who are watching the session after the fact. I'm going to try to keep today's session fairly short because I only have one real key thing to go over. So, let's get rolling and talk about that. Let me Okay, so welcome to week three. We're getting near the end, people. The course is a little bit on purpose stacked so that the first 2 weeks are kind of busy. So you spend week one with a research task that, as many of you found out, is a little bit more intense than you probably thought. I mean, it takes a lot of work to find three valuable sources that teach you something about your chosen role model's perseverance. A lot of you probably realize that it's easy just to find any three sources that happen to be about your role model or that happen to mention your role model, but it's a little bit more difficult to find sources that actually educate you specifically on the issue of perseverance. And then we follow that up, right? You guys have just handed in your essay. By the way, we instructors do aim for a 72-hour turnaround time. It will probably take me most of the week, however, through Friday to get through them, just because I have three classes worth of students, and I'm not trying to make excuses. I get paid; that's my job to teach all of you guys. But as you've probably noticed with my feedback already, whether it's feedback on quizzes, whether it's feedback on that research activity you did during week one, I write pretty specific and detailed feedback for every student, and it's particular to you, so I'm not just rubber stamping my remarks with just a quick sentence or two, or I'm not writing canned remarks that could apply to anyone. I'm actually responding to you specifically, and that takes time. Plus, the way this schedule is set up, you actually things get light. Okay. For instance, this week's activity is peer review. You have other things to keep up on, like the McGraw Hill modules, the weekly check-ins that are due on Friday every week. But otherwise, things start to slow down because you've already handed in your essay, so that should be a huge burden off your shoulders. This week, you'll participate in peer review, and then you have all of week four to basically revise your paper based on my feedback, based on the feedback of your classmates. And again, in addition to the weekly check in and the final Learn Smart Achieve module, week four is completely free. So you don't have anything due this Sunday. That doesn't mean that I'm taking it easy or I'm not going to rush to get your papers graded. I am. It's going to take, it takes a lot of effort to get through 75 papers, during the week, but I'm going to get through them so that you have more than a week to consider my feedback and the feedback of your peers so that you can revise for that final Sunday of the month. Okay? By the way, the chat is again not working. I have no idea why it's not working. It's more than frustrating. But as usual, if you do have questions or comments to make, go ahead and make them in the chat. I can just read them out loud for everybody to hear. Same thing if you have questions. Okay, so if anything I say immediately sparks a question, go ahead and ask it, and I'll answer it during the session. Okay, so let's talk about peer review, which is the main activity this week. Really, peer review is, well, this should seem like common sense, right? It's a chance for you to hear from real readers, whether it's me, the instructor, or whether it's your classmates, about how effectively you're communicating, because you've probably been in this situation before. My background is in English. I've been teaching for a long time. I like to think I'm a pretty good communicator, and still, I need feedback on my writing, or my communication skills in general, because we can't see ourselves. What we put down on the page sometimes seems absolutely clear to us, but it might not seem clear to others. Or we might have a sneaking suspicion that there's something going on in our writing that isn't quite right. And we can feel it, but we don't exactly know where the problem is. So, yeah, peer review gives us an opportunity to get helpful feedback from others, to get another set of eyes on the work so that we're not just living within the sort of bubble of our own world and putting pressure on ourselves to sort of do everything, to create the writing, to evaluate the writing, to revise it. We're bringing in sort of extra help. Now, how many people here have participated in some sort of peer review in the past? In high school, maybe in another college level English class? Often, perhaps a teacher puts you into groups of three or four people and you exchange papers, maybe, and the teacher perhaps has given you a set of questions to consider. Have people participated in this before in the past? Andrew says yes. Brittany says yes. Okay, lots of people saying yes. Yeah, it's a pretty common activity, and there are variations on it. So when I've taught in the traditional classroom, I used to do something called workshopping. So students would actually have a date where they not only had to have their draft ready of their essay, but they would share it with the entire class. Okay, the entire class would read it, and then we discuss the work as a class, and the writer would sit there and remain silent. So there's a variation, but most people are pretty familiar with peer review. You've done it in some form or another. But what I like about the online version of this class, in week one where you were asked during the weekly check-in quiz to express, how you feel about English class or writing, in what ways do you feel confident or positive, or what fears do you have? A lot of people mention the fear about taking an online class, and I get that. Like online classes can seem perhaps distant. It can seem like the instructor is just this faceless person who's occasionally giving you scores on your work, but otherwise the person doesn't seem real. I try very, very hard to lessen that feeling. So that's why in my feedback to you, I try to personalize things. I try to make it seem like almost like a conversation or a dialogue. Almost like I'm writing a little mini letter to you every time I respond to your work. And then, of course, we have these weekly go to sessions that are designed also for you to see and hear that there's a real live human being on the other end who is interested in your work and who is committed to the class. But the other thing I love about online classes is that certain activities, I mean, they work okay in the traditional classroom, but they actually work better online. For example, peer review in the traditional classroom. Some students take it seriously, some don't. Some students view it as busy work, right? They come in for class that day, and the last thing they want to do is be put into groups to exchange papers and go through this list of questions that the teacher has prepared. And the great thing about the online version of peer review, which in some ways functions very, very similarly, is that because it's not occurring in real time, you have the ability to sort of handle things as they occur, right? So if you're in a foul mood, okay, you don't have to respond to your classmate's essay that day. You can come back to it tomorrow, or you can read one of your classmates' essay drafts and take some time to think it over. Okay, you go get something to eat, you wash the dishes, and meanwhile you're thinking about what you could possibly respond. So you sort of have this magical ability to kind of call a timeout. Okay, and you can't do that in the real classroom. That also means that there's really no excuse for people not writing quality responses, and we're going to talk about how to do that in this session. Because you have all the time in the world, well, or most of the time in the world, because this doesn't occur in real time, yeah, it's really designed for you so that when you are ready, you can thoughtfully look at your classmates' works and really respond with the best advice possible. Okay, so moving on. Okay, yeah, there's that blurb there, right? This is the first step toward feedback that can help you improve your work, while also helping your peers improve their work. So we're going to talk about that in a second as well, about how it's really twofold. I mean, you're helping your peers, but you're also helping yourself at the same time, whether you realize it or not. Now, this slide, it may relate to a quiz question that will appear in this week's weekly check-in. So, hint, hint, you might want to jot down some notes or take a screenshot or just trust yourself to memorize some of these really well. But here's some examples of how you benefit from receiving feedback. Okay, so this is the most obvious part. You're getting feedback on your work. So, what are the cool things about that? Obviously, you can discover what's working in your writing, as well as learn what needs improvement. You can get an outside, objective point of view. That's what I was talking about at the beginning, right? Get a different set of eyes so you can identify mistakes that perhaps you can't see. And then so on, right? You can improve the areas you struggle with. This is an important one too, to learn to accept constructive criticism. In week one, where people are talking about their fears, a number of people mentioned peer review, that they don't like it, they don't feel comfortable with it, that they're either uncomfortable giving feedback or receiving feedback. And again, as I give tips and suggestions on how to do that properly, it shouldn't be something that's fearful or anxiety producing. And yeah, there's something important about learning how to receive feedback because you're going to do that. You're going to have to get used to that no matter what industry you're heading in. I can't think of a job, big or small, where you're not going to have, I don't know, a yearly review come raise time, or that there will be department meetings, or if you're on the creative side of things, that people will get together to bounce ideas off of one another. So you have to get used to this idea that other people are going to give you feedback. And lastly, yeah, you'll practice being able to apply that feedback to your own work. And the final project in this course is exactly that. You're going to be revising your essay. I'm not going to talk much about that today because that's a week 4 issue. So we'll talk about revision next week. But yeah, you'll have to take the feedback that you receive and use it to produce your work. Because if you think back to the writing process, what do you call it? That circle that we looked at the first couple of weeks in the go-to sessions, right? Getting feedback and then revising is a crucial part of the writing process, but it's one that students sometimes skip or don't think it's important because they finish the essay and they feel so relieved that it's done that they think that they are done. I understand that, by the way. I can feel that way as well. Right? You put so much effort into the research and the drafting that when you're done, you feel like you are done. But there's actually more steps involved. I'm going to switch real quickly to the FSO platform to show you the assignment, but there's an important component of the assignment, which is the personal reflection questions that you have to remember to address. So, because that might not make sense, let me switch to the FSO page. Okay, so here's the activity we're talking about, right? Assignment number 3, peer review. It looks like a dozen people have already posted to the board. So let's take a quick sneak peek at that. Step 1 in the process is literally just to copy and paste the text of your essay to the discussion board. So I'm going to go into this discussion board. This is my first time peeking in, by the way. So we'll see how things look. Okay, so here's like, for example, Isaac, who's with us tonight. Isaac, there you go. He's copied and pasted the text of his essay to the board. Okay, that's what you need to do. Here, Jasmine has just, I mean, this is my fault. I should have jumped in earlier. I don't mind that people have a link to their saved document, their cloud based location for their paper. I kind of prefer that you copy and paste into the board. If you didn't do that, don't worry. It's not a big deal. It's just that your fellow classmates sometimes will skip past this. I know it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. You would think that clicking on a link in order to access the essay shouldn't be that difficult, but there will be students who don't want to take that extra step. So if you just have it pasted onto the board, that kind of makes things easier for people. But okay, good. Looks like, yeah, a lot of people have been jumping in. And yeah, I probably should have jumped in to remind people just to copy and paste. That's fine. We'll deal with it. But there's another issue too, okay? And if I go to the assignment sheet, for example, here, Seth has uploaded or copied and pasted his essay. And as you can see, there are some. I'm trying not to talk while I scroll because I've heard that can interrupt the audio. But as you can see, here he's got all these little comments here, like, I think the best part of my paper is focus, specifically, blah, blah, blah. I need to work on flowing, transitioning from one thought to the other. One thing I struggle with is the conclusion. Okay, so why is he saying these things? Because it's part of the assignment sheet. And I know there were some people who were concerned that the activity didn't open up until midnight last night, and that's just because I sort of wanted to prevent people from just automatically posting their work to the board without first reading through the instructions or having sat through tonight's go-to session. But if we look at the assignment sheet, okay, so here we go, peer review. And again, I encourage everybody to read through the assignment sheets thoroughly and carefully. But you'll see under here, here's the instructions, right? So copy and paste your essay and references to the board. Underneath the essay, answer these self-reflection questions. There are 3 of them, okay? So if you didn't do this step, if you were one of the people, and I think we have a few people in the room here tonight, Isaac is with us, I think Brittany is here with us. Yeah, you'll want to go back and edit your work so you can include those self-reflection questions, okay? And it should be simple. I don't see things from your end, but I think it's as simple. Don't you guys also see the edit function? So you can just go in and add the self reflection questions. Am I right about that? Can someone confirm? Isaac says yes. Okay, so yeah, please do that because it's not just part of the assignment, but it also helps guide your classmates, especially toward what areas you think you most need focus on. And it also allows you, the writer, to already begin thinking about what we looked at in that slide, which is that part of this assignment is to learn more about your own writing as well. It's not about just giving feedback to others, but learning how to look at your own work. Okay, so make sure that you do that. We're going to get into the peer responses and what I expect from those in just a second. But I will say that also on this assignment sheet, if you scroll down to, I think it's page 3, you have a bunch of questions to consider. Okay, you don't have to answer all of these, but if you're completely confused, because sometimes students say, and they're being honest, they're not trying to avoid the assignments or or be lazy or they want to go out and party instead of doing their work. No, they just honestly don't know, what am I supposed to put on the discussion board when I respond. Well, if you're completely lost or if you're unsure, page 3 has these sort of thought questions. Okay, so you can look at parts of the essay are strongest. What should the writer keep? Or what could be edited or revised to make it better? Specific questions regarding the introduction, focus, support, and development. Again, you don't have to answer all these questions, but you might want to look at them if you're unsure where to begin. Another good thing to keep in mind is that, okay, you don't have to imagine yourself as the teacher. I think there are actually some cautions about doing that. But think of in general, the sort of feedback that I give you. We're in week 3 now, okay? So you should have a pretty good sense of what this assignment is all about. What sorts of things need to be done, what sorts of things need to be avoided. So yeah, if you see in your classmates' work that, for example, issues of perseverance don't really seem to be on the page, you can raise that issue. Or if the student has written like a mini biography, right? They're just telling the life story of their role model and just expecting that their readers will automatically be able to see perseverance. Those are things to sort of point out. As well as like smaller issues. Maybe one paragraph jumps around. Half the paragraph's talking about A, but then suddenly out of the blue, it kind of starts talking about a new topic altogether. So, I mean, issues like that you can focus on. So, yeah, issues of organization, development, meeting assignment requirements or assignment parameters, all is fair game here. Okay, let me go back to my presentation. And my computer is running hot. Okay, how does the peer review process? How do you benefit from it? Okay, specifically giving feedback. We all know that it seems kind of obvious that you get something from receiving feedback from others. It's awesome, right? You're gonna get feedback from me. You're gonna get feedback from at least 2 of your classmates, hopefully. But how does it? How do you benefit? Like, do you get anything out of it when you sit down and respond to others? And I would say yes. And again, hint, hint, what's on the screen here might appear in a weekly quiz question. And I've lost my cursor. Hold on. Let me see. Let me see if I can resize this. Maybe I'll get away from the slideshow. Okay, people I think can still read that. Hopefully it's not too small. Okay, so here's a list of the ways that you participating in giving feedback benefits you. First, you get to practice applying critical thinking skills, okay? In order to sort of figure out what's working well, what needs improvement in your classmates' work, that means you have to think, you sit down and really think these things through. In a few moments, we're going to talk about things to avoid, and one of the things to avoid is writing those sorts of very general rubber stamped comments like "this looks great" or "yeah, this looks pretty good, but be sure to proofread." The sorts of remarks that avoid really looking at the paper and giving specific feedback. Because when you do give specific feedback, that means you had to have read the paper with some care and thought things through. In other words, critical thinking. You can also learn how to recognize what is working and what needs improvement in that piece of writing. And doing so strengthens your ability to recognize the same things in your own work. Okay, and I can't stress that enough. For example, my background is actually in creative writing, fiction writing. I've taught both beginning and intermediate fiction writing at other universities. And yeah, the sort of standard in those classes is that because they're kind of small classes of 15 students or fewer, when your day comes up for you to for your work to be discussed, you hand out, for example, your short story. Everybody goes home and reads it. You come back the next day for class, and everybody talks about it. You just sit there as the writer quietly and take notes. But even when it's not your turn to receive feedback, when someone else is receiving critical feedback, like I would learn a tremendous amount just from eavesdropping, right, from just listening in on that process, because sometimes hearing what could be improved in other people's writing would help me as well, because I would say, oh my gosh, that applies to me too, or wow, I had never considered that, but now hearing that, somebody making those same comments to somebody else, I'm learning a lot from that. So yeah, when you're going through the process of responding to another person's work, you are actually learning a lot about your own work as well. And these last two kind of touch on that, right? In doing so, you identify what you truly value in writing. And lastly, yeah, again, you can develop your skills with giving constructive criticism. So if you're someone who doesn't feel comfortable giving feedback, again, get over it. We're all big boys and girls. Um, we all have thick skins. And as we'll get to in a moment, nobody's going to be writing mean comments. Nobody's going to be writing the sorts of unprofessional remarks that would hurt another person. We're always being helpful. We're always being at least neutral in our tone. Even though ideally we're trying to be supportive in our tone. And if we're doing that, then yeah, giving or receiving feedback should be painless. Okay, some quick methods for critiquing. First, and by the way, this might be related to a quiz question. The first strategy or first method for critiquing is to concentrate, or I should say, categorize the different information that's in your classmate's paper, and they can be roughly divided into two categories. The first are what are called global issues. Okay. Um, Global issues can also be called big picture issues or higher order issues or concerns. This is the big stuff. Okay, these are things that affect the paper as a whole, like focus, development, organization. Okay, I'm going to take a quick sip from my drink. And you can probably tell why these are considered global issues, because this is important stuff. If your paper or one of your classmates' paper isn't talking about perseverance, if perseverance isn't clearly on the page, like that's a big issue. Like that needs to be fixed. It makes no sense to worry about, oh gosh, the comma's in the wrong space, or look, you misspelled a word here. Um, that's really, really kind of lesser concern because there's sort of big issues that have to be taken care of first. Or if there's little sense of organization, I've already mentioned the example of when a paragraph starts out talking about one topic and then halfway through it jumps to a completely new topic and yet a new paragraph hasn't been started. But sometimes, yeah, we have varying levels of writing ability in these classes. So sometimes people are very uncomfortable with just some of these concepts that some of you learned early on, like having separate paragraphs. So yeah, if you have a student who's writing just one ginormous paragraph that begins on page one and ends on page three, like that's a pretty big issue to point out. Hey, use paragraphs. But yeah, focus, development, organization, basically the big picture issues in a paper, those need attention first. That's where we begin. We don't begin with the small stuff. We begin with the big stuff. Obviously, the exact opposite of global issues are local issues. Okay, these are the smaller stuff, the small fries, the small fish, lower order concerns. It's not that these things are unimportant, it's just that they're of lesser importance. So, yeah, these deal with issues of grammar, mechanics, spelling, capitalization, word choice, proofreading. Okay, and it's not that, again, it's not that these things aren't important, it's just that sometimes students, if they feel uncomfortable giving feedback, they'll immediately jump to local issues because those somehow feel more comfortable. They require often less critical thinking because it's really easy to say, oh look, um, you misspelled here, that's supposed to be too, not to. And again, it's not that those that sort of feedback is has zero importance. It's just it's not as important as the bigger issues in a paper. So it's not that you can't comment on these things at all in your feedback, but you should probably keep in mind that I don't know. The majority of your response to your peers should be focusing on global issues, not local issues. Another strategy you use is something called the RISE model. You have a PDF document. Let me see if I can get to it real quickly. It's basically a model that you can follow to ensure that you're always writing quality responses, not just for this class, but for any class you're enrolled in. If you've taken creative presentation, which is a course that I also teach here at Full Sail, and I believe just about any class I think uses it. So this should not be the first time you've heard of or seen the Rise model, or actually you don't have it. I'll have to get that for you. I thought I do have a PDF, but it's not uploaded here. Okay, well, the good news is I have the information anyway in this session. And actually, I have to switch to be able to see it completely. Okay, so RISE is basically it's an acronym that spells reflect, inquire, suggest, elevate. These are the four goals that you're trying to accomplish when you read and respond to something. Okay, so step one is to reflect. This is to recall, ponder, or communicate. I'll try to convert this into down to earth language instead of fancy speak. But reflect is really just a matter of, did you understand what's on the page? Like, it's your ability to show that you've read it, you understood it, things make sense to you. Okay, it's sort of verification that you've read the piece and that you're more or less familiar with what's going on. Okay. So things like I relate to, or I like what you did when you said blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's sort of statements that show that you've read the actual piece. But we try to go beyond that. If you think back to the research based discussion activity from week one, there were a number of you where I basically had to say, I mean, I didn't use RISE model language, but to a lot of you, I was essentially saying, hey, you never went beyond reflecting. Like, you were doing a nice job just sort of making general comments about what the student had written, but you really hadn't gone beyond that. You really hadn't taken it to a higher level in terms of asking questions or making suggestions. You were just commenting on what was literally in place. So yeah, our next step ideally is to take it to the next level, which is to inquire. Okay, that means basically asking questions. Have you considered looking at X from Y perspective? When you said such and such, am I understanding you to mean? Okay. The next level is to suggest. Okay, so obviously we're moving past acknowledging what's been written, asking questions about what's been written, but to actually make suggestions for improvements. Okay, because if we don't do that, we're not really offering any sort of critique. We're just echoing what the student already knows. Okay, the student already knows that she's written X or Y in her paper. She also needs feedback, constructive feedback. So, for instance, you might consider doing this, or you might want to consider including supporting information for Y. Okay, and finally, ideally, you should be elevating the response to the highest level possible. Okay, which is and that's where you get this definition here. To raise to a higher degree or purpose in future writings. Okay, and there's some examples of that. Perhaps you can expand this to further address, or perhaps you can repurpose. Okay, so we're continuing making suggestions, but there's suggestions that are not only very specific, but apply to just future steps that the writer can take in revising her essay, things to keep in mind for her writing in the future overall, etc. Okay, and I'm going to try to get that RISE model PDF uploaded real quickly. By the way, if you don't look at the RISE model PDF once I get it up, or you can't remember the RISE model stuff from this session, that's all fine. That's fine. How many of you have had the RISE model before in another class? I'm right, am I not? Did you get it in creative presentation or maybe psychology of play? So I think, yeah, Travis says I have. Donald says all classes. Were you comfortable with the RISE model, or it sort of didn't make sense, or it sort of seemed esoteric? Esoteric is a fancy word for, yeah, maybe it's helpful, but it was kind of over my head, or I didn't quite get it, or it seemed helpful, but it seemed too textbook-ish. Donald says it was pretty straightforward. Okay, my point is, if you like the RISE model, use it. Okay, you're familiar with it, some of you. Awesome. Continue to use it. If you're not, that's fine too. The important thing is you should be doing the sorts of things mentioned in the RISE model intuitively if you can. Okay, so if you're able to do these things, write a thoughtful, helpful response to your peers. That's awesome. and you'll still receive high marks for doing so. Method number two is what I call the compliment sandwich. I mentioned a sandwich in last week's session regarding quotations. Remember, to make sure that you're not just dropping quotations out of the blue, that you always set up the quotation, you deliver the quotation, and you comment after the quotation, like a sandwich. Well, we're returning to food metaphors with advice for giving feedback to peers. One way to make sure not just the quality of your response, but to make sure that's even in tone, is to begin with a compliment, then make a suggestion or a critique or some sort of constructive advice, and then follow it up with a compliment. Okay, and this is not just a one time thing. It doesn't mean you run to the board and say, oh, I really like the specificity in paragraph three, but I think you could improve that paragraph by adding in a quotation or some stronger piece of evidence. But nevertheless, I still think it's a terrific paragraph because of X. Okay, that's compliment, critique, compliment. But that wouldn't form the entirety of your response. The idea here is that it's a repeatable process that you can do throughout your feedback. Okay, and this just kind of goes over what I went. Compliment the work first, then critique, and then follow it with a final compliment. Okay, there's one final method, and this is the describe, explain, advise method. In a lot of ways, this is really similar to the RISE model. It's just sort of leaving out one of the steps, or it's collapsing some of the steps together. So, for example, describe is very similar to reflect. Advise is very similar to suggest, the S in RISE. Okay. But in this model, which might be the one that you were most comfortable with, or it's the one that you might just do intuitively without even realizing it, we first begin by describing. Okay, so we describe the issue. I don't like that word problem. I'll have to fix that. But yeah, we describe the issue in detail. So we identify something in the paper and describe it. Then we move on to explaining. Okay, so if we notice that there's a lack of organization in a certain paragraph, first we mention it, then we explain it, because sometimes it's not enough to just say, "Oh, the organization in paragraph three confused me," because maybe to the writer, she doesn't see anything confusing at all. So unless you explain things, it's not as helpful of a comment as it could be. Um, okay, and yeah, it's an issue of being specific rather than general, of not just stopping at saying, oh hey, I noticed this, I noticed that, but actually specifically explaining what it is that you saw, and then finally, yeah, making suggestions, right, giving concrete advice on how to fix the issue. Here's some qualities of constructive feedback, and this might be related to one of your quiz questions. People are, in general, doing pretty awesome on the quizzes, but I do get concerned because I do see from week to week people are sort of guessing. They're trying to take the quiz, but they haven't read through the materials, they haven't watched the go to session, and I suddenly realized that, yeah, maybe I could be more helpful and not give you the answers, but hint at least a little bit stronger in the sessions where quiz material might appear. But here are the qualities of constructive feedback. First of all, it's specific, okay? We're not just being general. We're always being very, very specific. Helpful, that should seem obvious. We're trying to be as helpful as possible. Considerate, okay? We have to remember that these are real people on the other end. So we do have to pay attention to things like tone. When, for example, we speak to each other face to face, there are nonverbal cues that we can rely on to help the other person, the listener, understand things. So, for example, if you were to drop by my office and speak with me, something that might sound incredibly direct wouldn't sound so harsh if you saw me, for example, smiling, or using, I don't know, some other sorts of gestures that indicate that I'm not really being harsh. Um, on the other hand, yes, we're trying to be considerate, but we're not trying to be too nice. Okay, so we're not being shy. We're not just giving praise. Okay, we're not just running to the board saying, "Oh, great job! I really love your chosen role model. I learned so much from your paper. I would give this an essay an A if I were the teacher." By the way, that always drives me crazy because then it puts me in an odd spot. Because if it doesn't get an A, okay, but yeah, we're not trying to be too nice. Okay, and we're not trying to be too mean either. So we're not being overly brutal, harsh. We're not just pointing out errors. And by the way, I have to keep these things in check too. I always try to read over my comments before I click the submit button, and sometimes I even have to go back in and edit my comments because I realize, oh gosh, I maybe I could have pointed out what was working well a bit more, or here I sounded way too direct, and maybe it will be misunderstood. So even though I think emoticons are sort of corny, sometimes I'll stick those into my writing. Um, or I don't know, I'll use what are called softeners or qualifiers. That means that we don't say things with 100% certainty. We sort of cushion them a little bit. So instead of saying I was confused, I might say something like, "Oh, I was a bit confused here," or in this paragraph here, I was a tad puzzled. Right? So I'm softening my tone. I'm not saying things outright. I was confused. I was puzzled. What are you doing? Because that doesn't help anybody. Um, and yeah, we point out what's working and what needs improvement. So it's important to remember that there are always typically things that are working well in the paper, and we should be pointing those things out. And that we're always speaking to the writer about the piece of writing. And that's probably the number one issue I see. And I know that I can be sometimes breaking some of these rules early on. Because I can be incredibly direct, and I apologize for it, but I really do feel the need to be direct because it's the number one issue I see. People love to speak about what's how do I put this? They love to get caught up in the topic itself, right? Here it says always speak to the writer about the piece of writing. Like they don't speak about the piece of writing, so they'll talk about how much they love Jay Z or how much they love Oprah Winfrey, or they'll comment about how great a job the writer has done, but they never get around to actually looking at what the writer has written and examine it in ways in terms of what's working well and what could be improved. So yeah, that's our number one job. And by the way, if you're a friendly person or you want to make a few off-topic comments, that's fine. I do it with you guys all the time. I can't remember if we have some people with us tonight, but sometimes, yeah, I'll pause my feedback to say, "Oh my gosh, I love this person," or "Wow, this is what a coincidence. I just listened to this person's album last week. Uh, awesome." And I might even go further and give my opinions, but I always say, "Okay, let's get back on track," and then I return to giving feedback and give specific feedback and do so thoroughly. Okay, I don't just get caught up in off-topic issues. So yeah, be careful because that's the number one issue that I see. But really, if you can do these things that I'm sort of highlighting in this session, but just do it, intuitively, or you can do it naturally without consciously thinking about it. Awesome. But yes, our job is to be specific, to look at each other's work, um, and to be very, very particular when we point out what is working well and what needs improvement. We're not just running to the board and writing two or three sentences. We're not just running to the board and making general statements, vague statements. We're not just pointing out problems, but then not taking the next step forward and explaining specifically what is the problem or how it could be fixed. Okay? We're really sort of giving it our full attention. And because you have all week to work on this, and like I said, because this activity doesn't occur in real time, you can sit down and complete the peer reviews whenever you're feeling strongest. Yeah, there's not really much excuse for not writing thoughtful, in-depth, helpful critiques for at least two of your classmates. Oh, and let me point out something real quick. We're getting near the end of the session, so hang in there. Uh, okay, I won't bother going back to the discussion board because the machine's running slowly. But try to give attention to people who have not yet received feedback, okay? So I also get concerned when there's one person, typically whoever's post is near the top of the page, that person gets like 7 or 8 responses, but then someone further down the board gets zero. So if you see that someone's already received 2 responses, please move on to someone else, okay? I know that some people like to get these activities done with early in the week. They like to get them over with. But yeah, you shouldn't be rushing through things so quickly that you're just jumping in the board, fulfilling your requirement, and then taking off. Okay, so make sure everybody gets some feedback. Let's see, where was I? Oh, I was wrapped. Where am I? Okay, we're there. We're there. Am I at the end? Yeah, we're at the end. Okay, questions, comments. The last slide just repeats what I already said, right? The feedback takes time, and because you have literally lots of time to get this done, and you can do it on your own schedule. So if you feel like giving feedback at 3 in the morning, which I do sometimes, notice the timestamps, by the way, on sometimes the work or feedback you get from me. Sometimes it's coming in at pretty odd hours, uh, but that's awesome because you can carve out the time for you to do the work when you're feeling strongest. Okay, but questions, comments, concerns, anything regarding peer review or anything that deals with the class, maybe that we haven't touched on. McGraw Hill stuff, weekly check-ins. If you're comfortable with what we've gone over, you are allowed to go enjoy the rest of your evening. The Cubs are winning 6-4, by the way. I was able to finally look up from my computer screen and see how the game's going. But yeah, if you're comfortable with what we've discussed, go ahead and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll meet at the same time next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. But I will hang out here for a little bit if people have questions. Andrew says, nice bat reference. Thank you. I think that's a dated reference. That actually refers to the old Batman show that was on in the late 1960s. And it was syndicated for the longest time. And it would always end with, a glimpse at next week's show. And it would always say, same bat time, same bat channel. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now because I'm not going to continue recording if people don't have questions because that's going to be really boring for the people who watch it after the fact.